Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Matt from Matt's Bookshelf, and today I am talking about my 2021 reading achievements. If you enjoy this video, I encourage you to let me know what your reading achievements are in the comments below, or in your own video if you are a booktuber. This year, more than most, I've read a large amount of books. So here's a picture of the amount of books I read last year, and here's the picture of the amount of books I read this year. So obviously, there's a large amount more this year, majority of them being classics. And this year, more than most others, I've really started to come into my own as a reader and have discovered methods and ways of reading that have fit me personally. And I kind of want to share some of these new philosophies I've acquired throughout this year of reading, and also a large amount of the books that I've read this year that I consider to be achievements in themselves. So my first achievement, and the one I'm most proud of, is the number of James Joyce books I read this year. You may have watched my Road to Ulysses series, in which I read all of James Joyce's works up to Ulysses, and then read Ulysses and analyzed it in sort of like a my raw idea sort of method. And through this journey, which I should clarify, I think Ulysses is now my favorite book, and reading this James Joyce series has been my favorite reading experience ever. And it's sort of given me this new philosophy on reading difficult books, because when you go on Reddit and you look up, like, oh, I'm trying to read Ulysses, do you have any advice? Or I'm trying to read Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, do you have any advice? And typically within the description of like where the reader's mentality is, they're usually going into Ulysses not having read any of Joyce's other works. And I, having now read Portrait of the Artist, Dubliners, Giacomo, and Exiles, I don't think I would have loved Ulysses as much as I had I not read Joyce's work and followed him as he progressed as a writer throughout these works, and also researched the author as well, because there's so much of Joyce in his work, and especially in Ulysses, and Ulysses is a complicated enough book as it is. So why would you want to go into Ulysses completely blind when it's a notoriously difficult book? In this new philosophy, which I talk about in my How to Read Difficult Books to Get the Most Out of Them, is I no longer see any reward in just tackling the most difficult books, the most notorious difficult books in like Western canon. I think that a lot of readers, especially readers like me who like reading classics, sort of take for granted the idea of just picking up a book and reading it on your first try and expecting to get anything out of it. And I think books like Ulysses, although you can technically read, you can physically read it without having reading any of Joyce's other works or doing your research. I think you're ultimately depriving yourself of a better reading experience if you just dive into Ulysses for the sake of, well, this book is considered to be difficult and I can't be a big boy reader unless I read Ulysses, so I'm going to read it. If you're just reading it to cross off a list of books you need to read, I think you're ultimately depriving yourself of an amazing experience with this book. And it took me a lot longer to get to Ulysses and to read it, having read Joyce's other works, but ultimately the experience and the journey was a successful and rewarding one because, as I said, it's my favorite reading experience ever. Ulysses might be my favorite book ever, and even though there are a lot of difficult patches with the book, I think that I was always able to rely on my inherent knowledge of Joyce throughout my other readings to help me get through the more difficult sections. Another achievement I want to address is my reading of Russian literature for the first time. So much earlier this year, I read Roadside Picnic by the Strugatsky brothers. I didn't really enjoy it. And then I read Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, and I love the beginning and the end, but in the middle, I didn't really enjoy it. And then I read The Master Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, and I absolutely adored this book. Russian literature is interesting to me because I enjoy the dour topics and the dour setting and the fact that you're not really guaranteed a happy ending. But with Roadside Picnic, the prose didn't really get to me. I felt like the story was kind of half-baked. With Crime and Punishment, again, I enjoy the beginning and end, but I think the middle, relative to its status as being one of the best books of all time, I felt like it was kind of on a treadmill to a certain extent. I feel like it was kind of dragged off past any reasonable point. But again, there are moments of brilliance in Crime and Punishment that I can't stress enough, and that have stuck with me since I finished reading them. But Master Margarita, Mikhail Bulgakov, I went in with skeptical eyes because, again, I haven't particularly enjoyed the Russian literature I've read so far, but this book is absolutely incredible. I plan on doing a video about it. I did a video on Dostoevsky earlier, which I'll probably link in the description, but I want to do a video on Master Margarita as well, because this book is incredible, and it goes to show, if you're not enjoying a genre, if you're not enjoying, like, it's a literature from a certain nationality, from a certain time period, you should stick with it if you want to, because you never know, because you might end up finding a book that you do end up liking, or in my case, loving. And it sort of reignited my interest in reading more Russian literature, and I think I probably will in the future. Next up, I just want to briefly talk about one of the best books I've read all year, and that is The Leopard by Giuseppe de Lampedusa. Giuseppe Tomasi de Lampedusa, to be more specific. I'm not very familiar with Italian classic literature, at least not like, I mean, you could classify Roman literature as being Italian in a way, but I mean, modern Italian classic literature, if you will. And so I Googled one day, what are Italian classic novels? And this was largely considered to be one of the best, so I picked it up and read it because I'm of Italian descent. I am currently learning the Italian language, and, I just want to be more immersed in, Italian culture as much as I can. And I read this book. I did a video on it in which I praise it, and there aren't any spoilers in the video, so if you want to get my large thoughts on the book as well as like a review and see if it's for you, watch the video if you'd like. But as a general synopsis, it's about an old lord in Sicily and his family as they come to terms with the fact that the aristocracy of Italy is dying during the unification of Italy, which is led by Giuseppe Garibaldi, and sort of coming to terms with the fact that he's losing his power and there's nothing he can do about it. And it's a beautiful story. It's a tragic story, but it's very beautiful. And I think this book should be, talked about a lot more than it is, because it has some of the best descriptions I've ever read. And Lampedusa, unfortunately, spent his whole life writing this book because he's from a royal bloodline as well. And a lot of the experiences that the protagonist faces and the family faces are things that he struggled with as well. And he spent his whole life trying to get the book published, and it wasn't published until after his death, or didn't blow up in popularity until after his death. So he really only has this one novel written, and I can't help but think, what if we got more by Giuseppe Tomasi? But we never will, but at least we have this book, and I can't recommend it enough. And my final reading accomplishment that's unique to 2021 is my reading of mythology books. And you have the Odyssey right here, even though it's more of a legend than mythology, but it's still really, really old. And other than having read the Odyssey earlier, I don't really read that much of the ancient texts. And so reading Irish myths and sagas and Ovid's Metamorphoses were new experiences for me, for the most part. And although I struggle with these books at times, I'm ultimately glad that I did read them, because it's a new genre for me that I'm not very familiar with, and I look forward to reading potentially more mythology next year and in years to come. And speaking of the classics, I want to just briefly talk about the weirdest book. Well, not the weirdest book, but the most unlikely book I read this year, and that is Hypatia by Edward J. Watts, who is a history professor in California. I discovered this author in a podcast with Life of Caesar, and that's my favorite history podcast, my favorite podcast ever. And they're talking about ancient Rome and the propaganda that emperors dealt with when they were overthrowing one dynasty, and their dynasty was coming in and dealing with the complications of, we want to downplay the last emperor to make us look better, but also we don't want to lessen the prestige of being emperor as well. So they had to deal with those complications. And this has nothing to do with ancient Rome. Well, I mean, it does technically, but it has nothing to do with the podcast. But they're talking about this book as well, and so I want to pick it up and read it. And Hypatia is a Greek philosopher living in Alexandria, and she doesn't have very original philosophical beliefs of her own, but she carried on the message of Plato and the idea of Platonic love. And she lived during a very tumultuous time in Alexandria and in the ancient Roman Empire period, because it was the transition of power between the pagans into Christians. And so there's a lot of tension in Alexandria between pagans and Christians, as pagans are losing their control and the Christians are gaining control. And she lived as a sort of beacon of unity between the two groups until her brutal murder at the hands of a Christian mob. But the book itself specifically goes into her life and not her death. Her death is very famous, but the author, Edward J. Watts, wanted to specifically focus on her life because he thinks that what she was able to accomplish in her life is unfortunately overshadowed by her gruesome death. And overall, I really enjoyed this book, and I could see myself reading more about philosophy later on, but it was definitely a unique pick for me, as I don't really read philosophy very much. And it's not really as much about philosophy as much as it is about history, but there is a lot of philosophy in it because Hypatia was a brilliant philosopher. And so yeah, that was probably my most unique read of the year. And finally, I want to wrap up this video by talking about what I want to accomplish in 2022. Mainly, as I mentioned earlier, I want to read more Russian and Italian classic literature because I've been enjoying what I've been reading, and it's really a market I haven't dived into as much as I should. Same thing with Irish literature. Now I've read most of Joyce's works, and I've read all of Joyce's works, so there's no other James Joyce work I will ever have to read. I read them all, I'm done with James Joyce, never have to worry about him again. But anyway, there are a lot more Irish writers, especially during Joyce's time period, that I want to read more about. and in contemporary Irish writers as well, because I spent a lot of time in Ireland during a semester abroad, and I feel like Ireland is part of who I am now. And reading Joyce's works, especially during the pandemic when I couldn't travel, definitely helped to reignite my love of Ireland and the feelings of being in Dublin. And for history, I love history as well. I'm currently reading Suetonius' Life of the 12 Caesars, which I hope will be doing a video with Junzo later on at some point. And as for history, I would like to read more ancient Rome, post Julio Claudian, because I know a decent amount about that era at this point. But I mean, there's always more to know, obviously, but I want to get past that and read about some of the other emperors. But specifically, on a different historical note, I want to read more about the western frontier of the U.S. and the wars between the U.S. government and the Native Americans. There are many books about General Custer and the Battle of Little Bighorn and stuff like that I would like to read more about, because it's definitely an era of history that isn't really talked about in U.S. schools very much, unfortunately, and strategically done. But I want to get more into that just as a personal achievement or goal that I want to meet. And finally, another goal that I have is to read Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow. I'm thinking about doing a series much like Ulysses, where I read a bunch of works leading up to Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, and then read the book itself and do videos on different parts of the book as I read them. Someone commented in one of my videos, I can't remember your name unfortunately, but you gave me a very long list of things I should read for Pynchon in order to be prepared for Gravity's Rainbow. So I'll probably be taking that comment, because I know where it is. I know what video it is in, but I just unfortunately don't remember your name. But I will be taking that into account as well as I prepare a reading list for that. And of course, I'm reading Anthony Burgess right now. I apologize for not getting the Wanting Seed video out earlier. I actually went to Valencia, Spain in November for 2 weeks, and then came back for finals, so I've been kind of busy, and I finished the book, and I just have not sat down to record a video, but I thought I wanted to get this video instead because it's more topical for the end of the year. And so yeah, again, I encourage you to talk about your reading achievements of 2021 and what you want to achieve in 2022, and check out my friends as well, and check out my other videos. I'll link some of the videos I talked about in this video down in the description below, and I will hopefully see you for the next video. Thank you and goodbye.